Hello, this is some video clip from a talk that was conducted at the East Hampton Library on October 15th with author Alex Amouyel. There were some technical difficulties, however, the bulk of the recording is presented here. It is joined in progress, and it will begin in a moment. Just a quick introduction. Alex Amouyel, her new book, The Answer Is You, a guidebook to creating a life full of impact. Just a little bit about Alex. Alex is a founding executive director of MIT Solve, initiative supporting social innovators globally and with a mission to solve world challenges. Through her career at MIT, the Clinton Global Initiative, Save the Children, and more, she has met countless world leaders, CEOs, heads of state, and Nobel Prize winners. And we are happy to have Alex Amouyel. So without further ado, I'll turn over the talk to Alex.
Your life, your traumas, everything that makes you you and makes you unique. And those are things that you can and should contribute to the problems and to the problem solving table. And really thinking through that is really helpful in being honest, because we need, there are a number of lawyers in this room, not looking at anyone in particular. And we need a lot of lawyers in social impact. We need chefs, we need filmmakers, we need people who have skills to give. And so everybody can contribute something, but also through your life experience and sometimes your traumas, those are the things that are also going to mean that you can connect with other people, that you can relate to the problems that your community faces, your family face, that this country faces in a way that's meaningful. And once you sort of think through your superpowers, identifying problems you really care about and that resonate with you, either because they're personal problems or because they're injustices that, really I sort of talk about, and this is a quote from another person, Natalie Molina, who says, find problems you can punch, sort of thing, things you're really riled up about. Once you find the intersection between your own superpowers and a problem, then that's your purpose, and that's sort of what you want to get to. And that sometimes is evident, right? And sometimes it takes years, and that's okay. But as you sort of set off on that journey, thinking through what can I bring to the table, and then what do I want to work on, is sort of really important. And then the second main piece of advice, I think, comes in chapter 5, which is called Start with 10% of your time and money. Because I think often we get overwhelmed with work, with family, with obligations, with various things, and it's okay, and you don't need to, and I probably don't advise that you'll quit your day jobs without a real plan or an idea of what you want to do. If you do, what King Circle is about, if you're interested. And in doing that, you'll just expand your knowledge of the problems. You'll meet potential people who want to help well, and co-travelers and things like that. And before you know it, that 10% will just balloon into something more. Examples in the book, in fact, a lawyer, Isis Booth, who's based in DC, who was a lawyer, a frustrated lawyer. And at some point she was working for the Mortgage Banking Association sort of during the financial crisis. So she had some qualms about that. And she started volunteering for social impact startups on the side. And ultimately that led to the job, that volunteering led to the job she has now, which is she's the or the Lex Mundi Pro Bono Foundation, which is a foundation which dedicates pro bono legal services to nonprofits and startups. And she wouldn't have gotten that job or even known it existed had she not sort of started on the volunteer track. So that's sort of the two main pieces of advice around this. I guess the last thing I'll say And I'm happy to talk, also ask me, who my favorite story is, although I tell you I have no favorites, but I'm happy to tell you a few of the stories there. I think in the end, a final reason one writes a book, I think, but I realized that afterwards, are obviously selfish ones. And maybe people tell it, people who do write books tell you this, that yes, you write it for yourself. I think one of the chapters that was the most eye-opening for me is probably the last chapter, chapter 9, which is about taking care of yourself and investing in yourself and thinking through burnout and difficult questions and things like that. And I think I wrote that because I needed to listen to that more for myself, but I think it's still a helpful chapter for other people, that this work is really tiring and the problems of this world are so immense when we listen to the news, and when the problems facing our communities and our families, that can be overwhelming and thing. So there we are. I feel I've spoken enough at you as an introduction, but would love to open it up to questions and we see how we go. Questions from inside the room or on Zoom, please. Oh, yeah,
we
super.
have any questions from the audience at home?
Yes. Yeah, Pat, you should introduce yourself as well, please. Oh, wait for the mic. I think there's a mic for the Zoom.
I'm Patricia. I'm Alex's collaborator in her book. She did a great job. I just kind of helped her. We did the interviews together, and it was a great project during the pandemic because these people dedicated so much savvy and work on the ground in their various countries were so inspirational to talk to when we're all hearing about drama and horrors all around ourselves and around the world. So it was a great assignment. And I'm wondering, Alex, so much has happened even since the book came out, between the crisis in Iran, these 2 young people throwing, was it paint on the Van Gogh in the museum in London?
Oh.
I mean, there's so many examples of people, but I mean, you can't really equate those two. Those are very superficial. But the action, even though it seems like vandalism, has gotten tons of play, and people are actually giving them credit for at least calling attention to the climate crisis when American politics seems to be more subsumed by inflation and things like that. So bringing it back into the news. But on a more serious note, what about the situation in Iran, and where do you think it's going to head? I know this is quite what the book is, but just to go to a larger agenda.
Oh my God, yeah, that's a hard one. No, just to be clear, I don't have any Iranian examples in my book. Maybe if I was writing it now, I would have included some Ukrainian examples and some Iranian examples. So, I guess that's books are obsolete the minute you write them to some extent. Hopefully not. Hopefully there's still a lot of evergreen lessons from this book. But I think in terms of what you're talking about, Pat, and big thank you to Pat. Couldn't have done this without Pat. Really, was so much fun. And yeah, the interviews I think were the most fun part for me. This is Julie Bertolina, who's also French and professor at Harvard. She wrote an article in SSIR, quite short. So, SSIR is the Stanford Social Innovation Review, and quite short article, which says, are you an agitator, an innovator, an orchestrator? And she says that you need all 3 of these types of people for social change movements to take effect. And that if you just have the agitation, which, she uses the example, and this article is a bit old, but I think still relevant, of like Occupy Wall Street and these different movements, if you have this agitation without innovation, so protests and grievance without the solutions, then it fails. And if you have protests and the innovators, but you don't have orchestrators, and by that she means sort of people government, in corporations, in people in power who are in the system, who are ready to translate the solutions and listen to the grievances from the agitators, then again, it sort of dies. And so, you know, she asks, like, who are you in that system? And I do believe you can't be, it's very hard. I don't think one person can be all three things, but when you think about who you are and what you want to achieve, adopting at least one of those personas, but then recognizing you need the other two becoming important. And so in the book, there's not a lot of agitators, I would say. More of the book has more, there's a couple of agitators. I think Amanda would be one of them, but there's a lot more innovators and orchestrators in my book. And probably that's my own bias, because that's a little bit more who I am. And also because, yeah, maybe I didn't know as many agitators in that way. As regards the situation in Iran, I'm not a political scientist. I don't follow Iran as much as I should have. I hope it's, you know, and I guess one of the people we interviewed, Hala, from Lebanon, sort of talked about the Arab Spring and her own activism in the face of the Syrian departure out of Iran, Lebanon back in the day. And I think there's, you know, this is a key thing, is like, does the agitation lead to any change, or does it lead to backlash? And obviously in Iran and its history, in its history, there's been a lot of frustration. And if you also look at the Arab Spring, there's a lot of frustration that, you know, periods of openness and protest then get torn down. And so I hope that's not the case. And I hope that this period to real change, but unfortunately we haven't seen that always in the case of all these movements. I do think generally an optimist, and I do think, you know, the arc of history slowly but surely bends towards justice, and that the world is changing, and that have to keep trying. So, but you know, absolute kudos to one, especially the women in Iran. So yeah, and in fact, well, she was a refugee. If you remember, she's a refugee in Iran. So Roya Mahbub is was born in Afghanistan, I believe, or maybe Iran. But she's an Afghani refugee from Iran who then went back to Afghanistan during after 2003, so after the American intervention in Afghanistan and the fall of the Taliban. And when she was in Herat, she discovered, she heard of this internet cafe, and where you could communicate with the world, where you could see the world. And that became, I can't remember how old she was, but I think a teenager. And that just opened up everything for her to understand what a computer was and to understand the internet and the power of the internet. And so she became a computer scientist, and her parents were, I think, they were both public servants and academics. So they were very differently minded, I think, than some others, and encouraged her to pursue this. And she set up something called the Digital Citizen Fund, but essentially one of the first places in Afghanistan teaching robotics, teaching STEM education to girls, and also teaching women how to be entrepreneurs, and even paying them in Bitcoin, not because I don't think it was like, I believe in the blockchain so much, etc., I'm going to become a millionaire, but because actually the currency is so volatile. And in fact, that did prove to be the case recently when the Taliban took over, is actually people who did have holdings in Bitcoin or could access them, whereas people who had holdings in the banks couldn't, like they were frozen. So actually that did prove to, unfortunately. But the thing which was pretty cool, and you might have heard her about her story, because she put together for the first all-female robot, which then there was a international robots competition that actually stems originally from MIT, which was being hosted in DC, and it was, I think, 2017, but long story short, under President Trump, and the visas were denied of these young Afghan girls because the Muslim ban, et cetera, and they managed to petition the government, and in the end he granted them an emergency visa, and so these Afghani girls were received as heroes in DC. And then I think the good or sad story about this is that when the Taliban took over in 2021, these girls were targeted, and so they had to escape, and they managed to escape, but they're now in Qatar, and the school has been closed and various other things. So unfortunately, I guess the story is still ongoing, but there's a lot of really interesting. Roya is an incredible person and one of the people in this book and doing incredible work and alive. So. Other questions?
If anyone in our audience has any questions, please feel free to type in the chat.
So I'm wondering what you make of social media's involvement or as a vehicle for people's involvement in social change movements, particularly TikTok and Twitter and Facebook. There's a lot of misinformation, but I also think it's one of the ways that young people in particular are gaining their attention is being grabbed by it. So I'm just wondering what your opinion is.
Yeah, the slacktivists, as they're called potentially. I think it goes back to, I think social media's, like all technology, can be good and bad and neutral, right? It's what everybody does with it. There are great examples initially, at least in protests in Myanmar and the Arab Spring, of the use of social media to galvanize, to sort of bypass government crackdowns and to like galvanize people to get together and organize the protests. And that was like, as part of the Arab Spring, that was shown to be this credible tool. And obviously now we see the valence of these very same governments and these very same tech companies who are allowing that, which, you know, is in fact leading to more people being arrested and other things. So, you know, and this is an extreme example in that way. So but I think social media, just like any other technology, is a tool, and it can be good or bad, and it's how you use it and how the people who make the technology put in guardrails and ethical guardrails around that. I think as sort of young people, so liking a cause or reposting something or doing this ice bucket challenge, or I think, again, if it's part of a, you know, if that engages them to donate more money, or that their parents donate more money, or that it encourages them to learn more about the issues and it educates them about different things, even if it doesn't change the issue itself, I think that that's still really valuable. I think the risk is obviously that you substitute actions. I've liked something, or I've posted about my support of the Black Lives Movement, or whatever it might be. If you substitute that action for real, you know, yes, it contributes to building the movement, to showing your support, to but if you substitute that for real change in your life and real change in whatever, your purchasing habits and your volunteering and other things, then indeed the risk is like everything. It's just sort of signaling, and it in fact crowds the space and makes more noise than it is. And I think, but I think that, I actually think this generation, and by that I mean sort of Gen Z, a lot of these climate protests they've organized and things like that, which are a lot of based on social media, go way past that sort of I'm liking something. And I think, and so in that sense, I also think somebody who studies this better than I think would know better. But I also think that was the early trend of the internet a little bit, that you would sort of vote for your favorite charity and think that was good enough, and that this new generation is using social media in a much more purposeful way and that is more action orientated. But again, the agitation, if we go back to Julie Bertolini's framework, you just also want to ensure that that as a movement, whatever, say climate change, is not just staying in the agitation column. It needs to also connect to this innovation and orchestrator column. And I don't think it's the responsibility of the high school children who are protesting, following Greta Thunberg, to figuring out what the climate tech solutions are and to negotiate with governments to cut their emissions, but how those different pieces are connected is what will make their protests and their social media successful versus die. So, but I think there are people who, and even young people, there's an organization which isn't in the book, but which is called one of the co-founders is called Tanasi, I forget his last names, but it's called Civics Unplugged, and it's kind of a version of Solve, which is where I work, but for young civic innovators, and they support with small grants and basically all around the world young people who want to make change in civic life. It's pretty incredible, and it's all self-organized by people who originally were under 18. Now some of them are a bit older, but it's pretty incredible. But yeah, but thank you for your question. More questions from Zoom or inside the library?
Hello. A question I have is for those of us that work within social impact, a question is how do you measure the impact that you're really having, and especially when the effects, may take a long time to materialize, and how do you stay motivated?
Thank you for that question. That is chapter 8. But I forget what the title of chapter 8 is, but it is basically about measuring and thinking about trying to at least get some evidence that there are impact. But yes, I think some of the tension is if you're really trying to affect change, some of that change on people's behavior, on mental models, on different things, it takes 10, 20 years, if not generations, and that, I don't know, addressing structural racism or taking down the patriarchy is going to be really difficult to really measure in short bursts of time, and your individual action in that. And just for example, Terry works in film foundation, so some of it is like representation, the media are extremely important, but whether or not you can then measure their effects on real change to the ground could be really difficult. But what I advise is taking a balanced approach. There's in fact another book which came out, and his name now. Might remember it. It's the guy with the, anyway. Yes, exactly. Do you remember his name? Never mind. Oh yeah, well there's a lovely man from Oxford who's called William something, I think, and who wrote a book recently which is about apologies, now I'm like completely, not only am I forgetting his name, but I'm forgetting the movement that oh yes, that is. So it's called the effective altruism movement. And essentially it's these like hyper measurement obsessed people where everything has to be measured else, and everything has to be proven to have an impact else you shouldn't do it. But then, and you shouldn't do it, which means that you would never fund a film which is trying to show diverse representation of people in it, because it's like being able to show the change within, being able to demonstrate that there's that film that helps to change people's minds about queer people, about women, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, that's in one sense helpful, I think, as a movement to say we need to measure more things, because indeed, and I use in the book the example of the US government's money and examples, for example, of job trainings. And you would think that if you're spending the amount of money the US government spends on job trainings, they would know whether or not people completed these courses, whether people got jobs at the end, whether the jobs paid more than the current jobs that they had, and whether those people kept their jobs over long term and earned more money off the course of their lifetime. That seems reasonably logical. But they don't, for the most part. We don't measure, certainly when it comes to government spending in general, but notably in this country, we measure maybe 1% supposedly of this, according to somebody who used to be in the White House, so Dave Wilkinson. So the issue, we need to do more measurement than we're currently doing, especially for things like this, direct services things, which in theory, did you get, you know, if you're doing food, a food pantry, did people get the food? Did people, are they still going hungry? Is it nutritious food? Like there's things that are easy to measure that we're not measuring, and we need to change that. At the same time, I don't really think the effective altruism would lead you to only invest in a certain types of solutions and not things that are much harder to measure, but are ultimately just as important, if not more important, which is changing behaviors, which is changing people's mental models, which is thinking, applying those with dignity, and, you know, giving people agency in their lives and things like that. And so the best I sort of conclude in the chapter, it's not a full answer, I would say, but is to apply a sort of as scientific an approach as you can do, which is you have a hypothesis on what the change is that you want to see and how you might go about it, and you test that out, and then you have whatever metrics or whatever evidence, and that can be surveys, that can be data, that can be perceptions, that can be interviews, quantitative data. And as you go, and ideally, you know, if you get third parties to do that more independently. And as you go, you test and refine and reform your hypothesis and iterate as you go. And hopefully you get somewhere that that really is helpful. And I think you have to not shy away from not trying to from just saying, oh, we can't measure this, so we're not going to do it. Or equally, if we can't measure it accurately, then we shouldn't fund it, because that both of those are two extremes that are not helpful. But yeah, it's not easy, because some of these things you don't see throughout your lifetime, for sure. And then staying motivated in the face of this is not always easy, which is why I mentioned this chapter 9. But it is about, I think it's starting off, as clear as you are on why you're doing what you're doing and your mission and your purpose, and seeing, I think, that you're not alone and that there's a lot of other people out there. The problems of this world, inequality, oppression, extraction, and justice are unfortunately universal. And there are many people in your community, neighborhoods, in your countries who have faced those problems too. And if think you can contribute, which you all can, that's basically the message of the book, which is why it's got The Answer Is You, then you can and you should, and every little does help. And in a sense, these stories are examples of people who I think should give you some optimism and some fodder to keep going. Question. Any more questions online or in the room?
I think we're good with online. Does anyone in the house have any questions? I just want to make mention that the book, the other book that was mentioned by the gentleman from
Yes,
Oxford,
found it.
it's William McGaskill. It's Doing Better: How Effective Altruism Can Help You help others do the work that matters and make smarter choices about giving back. And that is, again, that's William McGaskill.
One day I'll be on a debate table across it.
Alex, I just wanted to, on a practical level, ask if you could address two issues that I think you're very commonsensical about in the book. And those issues are volunteerism and donation. Well, it's the most practical way, if you can't get involved in an organization or a large social cause, to use your resources. And I think people have some illusions about both. Could you address practical solutions that are very accessible to anyone in these two arenas?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so let me start with the reverse one, with donations first. As I meant in this chapter, which is about starting with 10% of your time and money, there are a number of religions do recommend giving 10% of your money to charity. So, and yet you'll be maybe not surprised to hear that on average in the US, Americans give 2.1% of their money to charity. And actually, the richer you get, the less money you give. And also the whiter you get, the less money you give. So actually people who are lower income do in fact give almost 8% of money to charity. And I think in fact Black lower income people are generous people out there. And that probably still undercounts things in the sense that those are going to be registered donations as opposed to money you might give to your family, to your neighbors, which might not be registered formally as a charitable donation. But, there's lots of reasons why giving is good. You get a tax deduction, it makes you feel good, you get to interact on the cause you care about. And I recommend obviously thinking about it as strategically as you can in terms of, it's great when your friends say, hey, could you donate to this thing or this charity I care about? But if you can think a little bit more intentionally about the problems you really want to support and you care about, and also in the combination of if this is where I want to go in terms of my purpose and in terms of my volunteering, if you can sort of start to combine the money with then volunteering, helping to raise more money, helping with, I don't know, if you're a marketing person, helping with their website, et cetera, et cetera. That's where you can learn a lot more. And then one of the things I adore are giving circles. I'm obsessed with them. I think they're great. You have, because actually when we talk about the word philanthropist, we imagine the billionaires, right? Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos and Mackenzie Scott, much more generous than her ex-husband. But but actually the majority of philanthropy is in the US, is small donors, is actually people who give much smaller amounts. But because they give small amounts, they're less powerful as individuals. Giving circles are a way for people to band together and to pool their money and to discuss strategically what a cause they care about. And it can be, you know, LGBTQ issues, or it can be women's issues, or it can be local, you know, climate issues or East Hampton issues or things like that. But e.g., one of the ones that I use in the book is very simple. There might be a chapter here, I actually don't know, but it's called Impact 100, and it's 100 women who give $1,000 each a year, but that's $100,000. And suddenly that's quite a lot of money to give out to a few nonprofits a year. And, you know, they drink, presumably they go and drink wine and have fun and get to know each other. And so through that, you're also meeting a community of like-minded people. And same thing for volunteering. Go do it strategically in terms of what issues really resonate with you for various reasons. And think of it again, not through the lens of, you know, I care about climate change, let me go and plant trees, but I don't really know how to plant trees. And so the people at this organization are going to have to spend hours teaching me how to plant trees. And really, they're going to be much better at planting trees than I ever am going to be. I'm speaking from experience. Some of you might actually know how to plant trees, but not me. Versus thinking through, again, if you're a marketer or a lawyer or a chef or whatever it is, that those skills are still going to be really helpful to your favorite tree planting organization or a climate change organization or whatever you decide is important to you. And those are the superpowers you should bring to the table. And that then, you know, go either find the tree planting expert volunteers or pay the tree planting people who can do that better and faster than you ever can. And so in both cases, and again, the same, I think through volunteering, you really get to, in most cases, as a volunteer, you get way more, I would say, than you put in terms of learning, in terms of, so if you can also donate, compensate for the time that the organization has to spend on organizing you as a volunteer, I think those are ideal ways of doing it. But you will learn so much through that process and gain such a valuable experience in your community and on the issue you care about and meet people and things like that. It's such a, you know, it's a really wonderful investment of your time as you get to know things. So yeah, and there's some good examples. ISIS I already mentioned, but Hala, who after the explosion of that terrible explosion in Beirut, I forget what exploded now, but she was raising money as a side gig. She was raising money for Lebanon, which was undergoing a big financial crisis, and she got together a number of local restaurants in the Boston area to donate a percent of their winnings or earnings to during that time. But it was like both her volunteering, but then engaging other people, these restaurateurs and friends and family to take part. And so she sort of created a small mini movement around that. And obviously for an issue she cares about because she's Lebanese. Thank you. Any more?
What do you think about philanthropy through things like GoFundMe and Kickstarter?
So I think I will speak more generally to crowd funding and crowdsourcing websites, some of which are registered 501c3s, unlike GoFundMe and Kickstarter, and some of which are more geared to real, I think, better and geared to more social impact. The two that I think are really cool are Give Directly, which is all about saying, instead of, building a well or telling people what to do, let's just give cash transfers. And actually the evidence, the effective altruism movement will tell you cash transfers are a better use of money than almost anything else, because just giving money to help people not be poor, giving them money is basically a great way for them to not be poor. And in fact, there's also another organization which is quite cool, which is not a cash transfer organization, but it's Code for America, helps people register to benefits they're entitled to in the US government, which again, help people not being poor by helping them get the benefits they're already entitled to but don't know how to access, is also a great return on your investment. The other organization that I really like is Kiva, which does loans to different people. And what's interesting about that is that most people, you can loan the money and the repayment rate is actually really high. But then when if for those of you who are not sure about these donations and things like that, what's interesting is, like, you can loan the money, the repayment rate is really high, but then most people who start at Kiva never take the money back out. They just, they like it so much that they reloan the money. And so in fact, it becomes a donation. But it feels, safer in that way. So I recommend Kiva. I'm sure, GoFundMe and Kickstarter are used for a number of things. Sometimes, to launch a new cool product. I almost bought a paddleboard kayak foldable thing on Kickstarter, which I was really excited about, but now it seems like it's not in production. So I don't know. So luckily I didn't buy it, but I don't know if you have it. but so, there's that. And then there's awful stories we hear about people who can't afford their medical bills and who need to raise tons of money to do that. And in a sense, it's amazing that these platforms exist, whether or not it's for consumer product or for charitable purposes, etc., because it democratizes, similar to these giving circles, it democratizes giving, and it democratizes the ability. I think I would just, like everything we were talking about measurement and various things, I think I would just be careful of everything. There's everything and anything on these platforms, which is why also my bias. Things like Give Directly and Kiva are more vetted, and they are 501c3s to begin. Yes, Kiva is, I'm pretty sure. And a 501c3 is a non-profit according to the US tax code. But I still think, it's a real tragedy in this country that the state of health insurance and health coverage means that people have to go to GoFundMe's to money when a child has cancer. I mean, if we can, so it's good to donate, and it's also good to see if we can change that problem systemically.
Well, I'd like to thank you, Alex, for this wonderful presentation, and I'd like to thank everybody in-house and everyone who zoomed in at home, and I'd like to thank Hampton for supplying copies of the book. And if anybody would like to purchase a copy, we have some copies in-house for sale. But if you are in our audience at home and would like to purchase a copy, you can buy one at www.bookhampton.com, and they will be happy to ship it directly to you. This is Steve Spataro for the East Hampton Library, and wishing everybody a good evening and a good week ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. And thank you to the library and Hampton and everyone who came online and in person. Thank you.